Welcome to today's webinar, A Catalyst for Software Modernization, UX and UI Design. Now let's get started by quickly introducing our speakers for today. Chris, could you kick us off?
Thanks, Joelle. I'm Chris Longo, Service Delivery Manager for OpenEdge Professional Services here in North America. And I'd like to take a moment and allow our partners at Resolute Software to introduce themselves. Haristo?
Thank you very much, Chris. Excited to be here today. My name is Hristo, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Resolute. We are a long-term Progress partner, a boutique software consulting company. We specialize in UX, UI, digital modernization, cloud transformation, and AI enablement. Together with me, I have TK and Yana.
Hello, everybody. My name is Sviat Kokonov, or you can call me TK. I'm Deputy CTO at Resolute Software, and I spent the last 18 years working in the software industry in various domains, being part of Progress, and then after that, working on the challenge of modernizing solutions around the products that Progress offers. And today we are going to talk a bit more in detail about how the UX would be the catalyst in that direction. With me, I have Yana. Over to you.
Thank you, TK. Hello, everyone. My name is Yana, and I'm the UX and UI design lead at Resolute. I have extensive experience with designing and redesigning complex B2B applications. And today I will be talking to you about the value of design, the return on investment you can get, and how you can use UX and UI design to leverage your digital modernization.
All right, well, thank you guys. Welcome. So as TK mentioned, today we want to talk about how we can leverage the user experience to be a catalyst in driving modernization and continuous improvement. And to that effect, we're going to talk about modernization in general, but the main focus of the talk today is really going to be about the user experience. So before we dive into that, let's talk a little bit about modernization in general. So many of you, whether you realize it or not, have probably been on a modernization continuous improvement journey throughout your careers, depending on when you started working with the OpenEdge platform. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, you know, for all of us who were in the OpenEdge world at that time, it was all about taking monolithic applications or multi-tiered GUI applications and transforming them, you know, to the web or creating web portals. And that modernization journey really focused on separating the business logic from the user experience or the UI. You know, that's still relevant today. We still do a lot of that today in professional services. As we kind of move into the 2000s, cloud and mobile became drivers in the modernization space, and we've looked at, you know, creating user experiences that were extendable from the desktop to other different devices, omni-channel type of user experiences. And finally, in today's world, we're looking at ways of integrating and leveraging our data and implementing artificial intelligence to leverage that information and to aggregate and provide meaningful insight, you know, into our data, into our OpenEdge data, which we have, you know, probably years of history with. So, you know, what does modernization mean? Well, you know, it means different things to different people. Different organizations have different priorities. I think certainly the number one thing that comes to mind when we talk about modernization is the user experience. And hey, I've got an old user experience. Maybe it's old Windows desktop or a character user experience, and I want to modernize that. I want to take it to the web. And modernizing the experience, it's not just all about visual, it's all about workflow and improving productivity. And Resolute's going to talk more about that when we get to that part of the presentation. Third-party integrations are also a driver for modernization. doing that with APIs as opposed to file transfers, and taking that API first strategy. So, APIs have evolved over the years from remote procedure calls to now, we're looking at, doing REST and moving data with JSON as opposed to XML. And CI/CD is also part of the conversation, interestingly, because it's important in terms of being able to perform modernization steps in a repeated fashion, in an efficient, repeated fashion. And if you have a modern continuous integration and continuous delivery strategy, you can do that iteratively in an efficient manner. So that's an important aspect, and probably a topic for another day, but it's an important aspect to continuous improvement in modernization. So, when you look at continuous modernization, this slide illustrates modernization as a journey, looking at business objectives and aligning or understanding where the gaps are in terms of your current solution and where you want to be in the future, prioritizing, road mapping, and then implementing and delivering those changes. And if we drill down on that a little bit and look at modernization sort of as a single step, typically what we do with our customers is we'll first do an assessment. And the assessment step is really important because in this part of the modernization journey, we are uncovering or understanding the requirements and the business drivers, and then from that, developing a roadmap or a playbook that's repeatable. And that's important because if we can execute repeatable steps, then we can deliver return on investment iteratively. So the proof of concept is taking those ideas that are uncovered in the assessment part of things and delivering something on a small scale that proves out the roadmap, that proves the technology, that proves the steps are valid. And then from the proof of concept, we go into implementation where we implement the roadmap, the playbook, what we learned in proof of concept at scale. And what I mean by at scale, it can be bigger modernization projects, or it can be multiple personas that we're modernizing at a given point in time. So that kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of how we approach modernization. And we can certainly talk a long time about that. But what we want to really focus on in this discussion is, in all of that, where does developing a user experience fit in, and how is it a catalyst for driving that whole process, right? So with that, I am going to turn things over to Resolute to talk about the user experience.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Chris. I'm excited to introduce Resolute to the audience. First of all, we are UX UI consultants, and we focus on modernizing digital experiences. We've been a proud Progress partner since 2019, and we help organizations like yours design and implement modern, intuitive interfaces that drive real business value. We are not just technologists. We are trusted collaborators with a strong focus on usability, performance, and design systems. We embed ourselves as long-term technology partners for our customers, and together with them, we tackle all the modernization challenges that they have. And because we believe in happy teams, we build better products, and we're proud to be recognized with consecutive culture and happiness team awards. When you work with us, when you work with Resolute, you're partnering with experts who love what they do, and they bring their happiness together with them. Excited to explore how we can help modernize and elevate your product experiences. Next, TK and Tiana will walk you through how we do it in partnership with Progress and the expertise we bring to the table. With that, over to TK.
Thanks, Christo. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about the tech stack and how we're approaching the modernization in order to see where the UX UI lives in the whole journey and how it impacts us as the developers when we are making a modernization. When we're talking about the tech stack on which we are modernizing and working on, of course, at the core of it, there is the OpenEdge and of the products that Progress offers. This is the foundation, usually, where the solutions are built on, and they're delivering and driving the great value. But nowadays, we need to see how to get them to the next level. What we are using primarily when we are talking about modernization, we're focusing on Kendo UI and the Telerik suites when we're talking about UI, regardless of whether we are talking about web modernization, React, Angular, Vue, or any other kind of front-end technologies. And of course, when we are talking about modernization, it's not only UI. Sometimes we need to enable connectivity and seamless communication between different external services, dependencies. This is something that also can be part of the modernization journey. Our approach is driven by the agile methodology, and thus we are talking about iterations. In our case, usually we are looking for fast-paced iterations with milestones objectives, so we can get an early feedback and an early results when we are talking about driving a new modernization project. And at the very early stages, what we are looking for, we are first starting with, okay, we need to modernize a product, but where do we want to get? What is the end game? What is the goal here? Is it something in relation to, okay, we want to have this solution live in a web or a different form factor? Is it something that we need to adapt newer modern UI UX patterns that the workforce now is already familiar with, that weren't here, let's say 10 years ago, but now with all the consumer products, it's something that it's considered a status quo. This is where design actually is the most valuable asset, and this is where the UX helps in greatest extent, because it does allow you to be the first proving ground of what you are actually trying to solve, how we are actually trying to solve it in terms of a workflow, in terms of a final user journey within your product. So how the UI UX fits into all this? First thing, it's very important. UI UX is not just, okay, let's have a nice layout and a few buttons on the screen, and this is what the developers would receive. It's actually part of integrated process in which the designer and developer works together in order to provide the best journey, the best tool and instrument that we can drive towards the goal that is of question. So when we start the assessment part, we are actually looking for, is there enough maturity when we're talking about where do we want to get? If there isn't, that means we need actually to discover and unveil what would be the right tool, the right composition, the right approach when we are talking about a UX. So during that assessment, what we are looking for in those cases, we are looking for fast iterations in which we can get the different solutions that are getting us closer to the best approach that the next generation of your products can look at. It is much more efficient to have iteration that is working on top of the UX tools, rather than having a full scale and full-blown development cycle, only to realize at the end that this is not exactly what you're looking for. And this is on one side where the UX biggest return of investment is. The other thing is there are different ways that you can approach your solution. And when Jana and the rest of the team are offering designs and are offering UX as a workflow, they're also looking from a perspective, how much time would this one take to be implemented, to be integrated? So there is the other side of the coin. We're also looking not only from, does this one solve the problem that we have in front of us, but also how much effort it would take us to get there. Is it efficient to take that path, or can we do a slight adjustment that would not have, it would have virtually no impact at the end product, but it would save a lot of effort when we're talking about implementation. And with that, I'll give the stage to Jana, who would look a bit more into what is UX and how things are happening actually behind the scenes.
Thank you, TK. Now let's talk about what user experience and user interface design are before we explore how they can help you accelerate your software modernization. You would normally see UX/UI design written together, and you may assume that these two are a substitute for each other, but actually they are quite distinct. We can say that the task of UX design is to define and to understand the business goals of the product, to understand the pain points of the customers and the users, to look into the technical dependencies and the limitations that we have to keep in mind when we are designing, so that we can provide some relevant and robust design solutions with only the necessary level of customization. When we speak about UI design, in the ideal case, it will come as a result of the UX design work that has been done previously. And beyond just making the interface attractive, user interface design is about making the visual language consistent. It's about showing a strong brand identity within the product, and about making the software usable across different devices and suitable for people with different user needs. The classical definition that we can use for UX and UI design is to say that UX is how the product works and UI is how the product looks and feels like. However, we can go further and say that the UX design is the why and the UI design is the how of the product design process. When we are doing UX design, our goal is to understand things like what problems we are solving for the user, how a user would interact with the product to complete a specific task, what are the most feasibly simple and efficient workflows that we can design. After we have achieved this understanding, we use it to make design decisions in the user interface design process. When doing UI design, our goal is to produce, once again, a strong brand representation to ensure visual consistency throughout layouts or typography, color schemes, components, and so on, and to make the UI visually appealing and suitable for use. When we work with software products and we start from scratch, this is the ideal case. We will always start with UX design and use it to inform the UI design later on. However, it's very common for designers to join the product development process at a very late point, when the product has already been live for years, in some cases for decades, when we talk about legacy systems. And usually there has not been any UX design work done previously at any point. This does not mean that we need to start to scrap everything and start from scratch so that the designer can start doing their work. Actually, you can try to make improvements to your product with either UX or UI design approaches, depending on your priorities, on your goals, and on your strategy. You can try small improvements. For example, we have had previous experience with clients that have both feedback from customers and they have also analytics data about the user behavior that and both show that the users are happy with how the software works, but they are very disappointed from the way that software actually looks, because it's quite old school looking and not up to modern standards. In such cases, something like a brand redesign and UI modernization should be sufficient to provide enough customer retention and positive outcome for the business. Problems like outdated look and feel, inconsistent layouts, or even bad accessibility, let's say, can be fixed relatively quickly and easily with a couple of iterations of UI design and UI testing with the users. However, there is a more complex situation when we're talking about clients that are really unhappy with the product. They would usually resort to workarounds. They will flood your support ticketing systems with issues and complaints. And in this situation, it is not an adequate decision to address the problems with just UI design. You need to also invest in UX to improve the user experience and the customer satisfaction. In short, we can say that UX in general is used to improve the journey of your users, while UI is used to improve the look of your software product. Both are required to transform legacy systems into modern and competitive tools. How you go on about employing them depends on the most pressing problems that your business or your users are experiencing. Now, talking about problems that could be resolved with design, we can say that we are lucky to have a very wide range of tools and approaches that we can use at any stage of the product development process. I have done a bit of research to see what are the most pressing problems or pain points that the users of OpenEdge systems report. And they are actually quite common, not only for OpenEdge, but most legacy systems. Firstly, the users complain about confusing navigation. This means that when they go into the application, the users cannot find their way around, and they cannot complete their task in an efficient manner. So this means that they cannot get their work done on time efficiently. The solution here is, for example, to conduct an information architecture mapping workshop or exercise to see how the application structure can be simplified or can be ordered in a more logical way that corresponds to the user's mental model. Another problem that we have for users of OpenEdge systems is that they are overloaded with information on the screen. They have very complex grids and forms. The actual screens they interact with are filled with data without any clear indication how they should interact with it. The approach that we can take here as designers is to employ some progressive disclosure methods like using wizards or steppers or grouping complex forms into smaller chunks that make sense for the user and only showing them when they are necessary at the point of interaction. One of the more serious problems is that users of OpenEdge systems report that they rely on Excel spreadsheets to import and export data and also to analyze it. This is a sure sign that the system isn't working up to the standards of the user, and it's not satisfying their needs. So they have to resort to a workaround and use another system to actually do their work. As designers, we advise that in this case, there should be a fundamental redesign and improving of the interaction flows so that they become actually useful for the users in a way not to make the users act like we want them to, but to adjust the user flows according to the user behavior. I will show you here an example of an interface that has all of the problems that I just mentioned. This is an actual case that we had with a customer. This is an ERP system based on OpenEdge, and as you can see, there is no clear information hierarchy. There are quite a lot of inputs on the screen. You might not know, if you're not a very experienced user, where should you go? What should you do next to complete the task that you are supposed to do on this screen? For me, as a novice in this interface, it will be impossible to complete any task at hand. I just get cognitive overload from everything that I see on the screen. What follows next is how the system was redesigned. Here, I have to say, a full disclosure, the work that we did on this project was development work. This is design work provided by the client themselves, but it's a very good example of how using common and easy to understand layouts and design patterns can improve the user experience and the user interface at the same time. So here you can see clearly, I'll just switch back to the previous screen for comparison. At a glance, you can understand that there is a top navigation, there is a side drawer with sub-items that you can use to navigate. There are breadcrumbs that tell you where you are. And there is a filtering panel and search that you can use. Also, you have a list with items that you click on, and in sort of the middle of the screen. And in the right-hand side, you get the details of the item that you've selected from the list. This you might identify as a very, very common layout. It's used widely in software like the Outlook mailing client, for example. The point here is that the design is not unique, it's not very flashy, it's not very avant-garde, but it's fit for the purpose. The user is well aware which component in the layout does what and how they should interact with the interface to complete their task. In other words, the goals of UX and UI design are not to produce piece of art design, especially for enterprise systems, but to provide layouts that are easy to understand, easy to navigate, and they make the users feel comfortable, confident, and they are sure that they can complete their tasks efficiently and on time. Apart from making the interfaces more easy and pleasant to use, the design work has added value both for the users and for the businesses. In the context of legacy systems, we can say that design can be time and effort saving, both for your users and for you. For example, removing unnecessary steps in the process, or regrouping a complex form, or rewriting an error message so that the user understands how to recover from the error, are not very costly and time-consuming tasks or changes, but they can have significant positive effect both on the user and on the business. When it comes to creating efficiency for developers, I need to point out that as designers, we are not blindly advocating for the users, but we rather tend to mediate between the user needs and the business needs. It's part of our job also to create efficiencies for the development teams. We bring value to the business this way by giving the development teams testing validated prototypes that they can use. And when we make the prototypes, we use standard layouts and components that help to reduce the rework, the time spent on quality assurance, the time spent on bug fixing, and so on. Finally, we can say that design approach is always iterative. It means that as designers, we always advise to make small changes, to test, and then iterate only if necessary. Good UX will not require you to rewrite an application in full. We can make legacy systems quite more usable with just some simple targeted interventions like simplifying the navigation, like grouping the forms in a more logical way, or by standardizing workflows. The topic of return on investment of UX design is quite interesting because the return on investment can be calculated with exact numbers, but it really depends on what you want to measure and how you define the success or the performance of the design. So I would not quote any numbers like $1 invested in UX and UI design returns $100 in value. We rather would define the return on investment with what we've seen happening to our clients' businesses after they have implemented UX and UI design in their product design processes. What we normally see is, for instance, that they have reduced training costs because the well-designed workflows and interfaces would need often little to no training. Also, prototyping would cut the rework of the development team quite significantly because they are only building once and they're not building, testing, and rebuilding on production. Also, you can see that the developers have a lower backlog churn. This means that they have better predictability on what their tasks for the next sprints will be, then they don't have to be guessing what comes next. There are several steps to take if you want to try and get value and return on investment from UX and UI design. What we normally recommend as the first step is to have a UX and or accessibility audit to identify the low-hanging fruit in your current application. It is especially useful if this audit is made by an external expert, since in-house designers or teams could be biased. They usually are accustomed to the state of the product, and they tend to overlook or to compromise problems that are obvious in order to avoid friction within the team to keep up with deadlines and so on. The next step you can take is to ensure consistency through creating a components and styles library. This is more mechanical work, and it depends on what your current state of component use and branding is. Normally, it's not a very big effort, especially if you are using components like Telerik and Kendo UI. It's a relatively straightforward process, but it provides consistency and flexibility in the long run. The next step is collecting and analyzing user feedback. In order to start making improvements to the workflows, of course, you need feedback from the users. Normally, we would advise interviewing 5 to 7 users, and this will provide enough insights to generate meaningful redesigns. However, you have to be very careful with designing with the way that you conduct the feedback interviews and the way that you analyze the data. If you have a facilitator that is kind of biased, you might not get the best results out of the feedback sessions. Once the design concepts are created in the form of prototypes, we can test them internally or with users before the development starts. The rule of thumb is that a design sprint would run at least a couple of sprints before development, so that there is enough time to produce, test, and iterate on the prototypes. The point of this testing with prototypes is to deliver a validated design to the development team so they can start the implementation work. After the designs are implemented into the live product, we advise you to collect user data or feedback to track the performance of the flows, or if you made any changes only to the UI. This will help you to identify poorly versus well-performing design patterns or workflows, and this can help you accumulate new ideas about improvement in future iterations. Now that we've shown you the steps that we advise our clients and partners to take, we'd like to share some customer success stories to show you how we helped some of our major partners in their modernization journey. The first success story is about modernizing a legacy healthcare app. This client had a desktop application that was developed over 15 years ago, and the application was used to provide access to a large-scale database of patient healthcare data and other critical information. The desktop app operated according to industry standards, and it had strict logic behind it and a lot of customization. The end users of these applications are real-life doctors and medical technicians, and they use the app while interacting with patients during exams. In order to reduce the friction for the users, the client insisted on preserving the user experience in the new web-based system we were going to develop for them. In addition, we had to take into account that different user personas were going to use the software on different devices. So we had to make sure that the new web application would be fully responsive on desktop computers, on laptops, and on tablet resolutions. We can divide this project into 3 main phases. In the beginning, both developers and designers worked closely with the client to define and prioritize the project requirements. In the next phase, the design team and the development team ran 2 assessments in parallel. The first assessment was assessing the Angular code base, and the design assessment was of the interface and the user experience. The outcome of the technical assessment was a list of performance issues and bottlenecks. The result of the UX UI assessment was a document with observations and recommendations combined with the prototype design concept. The third phase of the project, after validating the prototypes through several iterations, the development team created, documented, and tested custom components and layouts. And we can say that this engagement served us as a proof of concept for a long-term partnership that continues to this day. We are helping our clients with their modernization by producing currently both designs and development.
Let me share some thoughts here from a developer perspective as well. Some of the benefits that we gained as developer during the development cycle was specifics in this modernization case, in which we identify that there were very specific usage patterns for different inputs, and the design help us and the UX help us tremendously of identifying which of those can be handled by off-the-shelf components and which of those needs to basically deviate from there and go to custom-built UI libraries. There were a couple of those, but the initial assessment identified just a small number of those related to rich text boxes, data fields, and some combo boxes, which helped speeding up the development process.
Thank you, TK. Now I'd like to share some real-life prototypes that we've done for this project. This is the design tool that we are using. It's called Figma, and it's the standard design tool that is currently used and has the greatest capabilities for both design and collaboration. So this is what a prototype looks like initially. These look like sections with images of the UI. However, behind each of these, you can see that we have layouts that actually live in a library file. So if we go to the library file, every layout that is used in the prototype and every component and every style actually lives in a library file that can be shared across different projects. This means that we have a centralized way of managing changes in the components. If we go here, you can see an entire layout of a grid that exists as a component, but if we drill down deeper, you can see that the separate items in it are also components. So we can go, for instance, and check our top navigation. We can see which variants of the navigation we have. We can have also additional information about how we should use it. And then we have also variables that control our modes of visualizing the content. For instance, here we have dark mode and light mode, and we can easily switch between them without having to draw the component a large number of times. So you draw it once, you link it to variables for example, spacing or colors, and these are controlled via a single file, and the changes can be pushed to all the projects that employ this library file. Let's see. Let's go back to the prototype and see how it actually helps the developers. When they switch to development mode, they have all of the information that they need when they inspect the component. For instance, if they are wondering what the name of this icon here is, they can see that this is the icon clear search. It's used with this variable, this is the SVG code, and so on and so forth. This helps developers to create pixel perfect implementation of validated prototypes. Another functionality that we have in here is to show the links between screens that are the actual interactions that we expect the user to perform. So I'll just zoom out so you can see we can link any element on the screen to another screen or a different state to visualize how a functionality should work before there is even a line of code written. And maybe the most impressive or useful feature of the prototypes is that you can actually play the interactions. I'll try to expand this to the max. Okay, so this should be the view. So we can use the prototypes also to perform user testing or to validate the user flows with stakeholders. For instance, in here we have a workflow to try and use the new AI assistant functionality in the app. In order to do this, we will have to create an exam. Say we'll add a new patient. We'll say this will be the type of exam. We'll end up here within the exam. This is assuming that we are an experienced user. We'll know well where to go and click around. Let's say we can change the view here of the images taken during the exam, or we can go directly into the form that the medical technician or the doctor will fill in while the patient is at the actual exam. So if we say we want to test the AI functionality or to show it to our stakeholders, we will just go here, click and open the AI assistant, and we can visualize how we start a voice recording of the exam. The point is to keep the doctor interacting with the patient without interruptions for writing in the form or without having to fill in the form at a later point and forget some of the information. You can see here the AI assistant gave us a summary of the conversation that was held during the exam, and we can go further on and say, please fill in the form for me. And the AI assistant will fill in the relevant fields and will mark them as filled by the assistant so that you know these inputs were not made by a human and may need to be checked. And this way, by producing this prototype with relatively little effort, we can validate both the UI and the workflows without having the development team develop, build, rebuild, test, and do any changes on production.
So for the next success story, I can start to talk a little bit more. This is the one that was software modernization that was in the public safety sector. The legacy system was a desktop application, but the goal of the business was to try to cover more use cases. At the stage of initial engagement, the desktop system was primarily used within the office on a laptop or on a machine. But the needs of the business was that it needed to be used on the field, both in a vehicle or walking around on a phone or on a tablet. So it was impractical to think of it basically, let's try to adopt the existing application. We needed to think differently. The other aspect was that the workforce was used to a pattern and a specific layout that also dated back from the paper forms layout. So there were very specific habits and patterns that needed to be retained. And the third aspect was that usually during collecting information, there were a huge amount of forms and fields that needed to be filled, which basically was becoming a UX challenge. The solution that we came in terms of how we ended up is a complete UX redesign that is targeting all the form factors. There were several patterns that were specifically designed for this use case and specific editors that was able to present in most efficient way the information that needs to be collected. And in terms of technology, we opted in for Angular that was able basically to fit any form factor with the responsive design provided by our UX experts.
With this, I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I would like to finish with a single key takeaway. Adding UX and UI design to your product development process is a time and cost-efficient way to modernize in a faster and a safer way. And it has added value both for your users and for your developers and your business. And if you are interested, you can read more about client success stories on our website, or you can feel free to reach out if you think UI UX assessment is the right next step for you in your modernization journey. Thank you, guys. And now handing over to Joelle.
Thank you so much, Yana. So let me go ahead and put my camera on here and invite you all to do the same. So I realized I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of this. I'm Joelle Andrews, Senior Product Marketing Manager, and I am going to lead our question and answer session with everyone. So first question, you all, Yana, I believe it was you were giving a great description at the beginning about the differences between UI and UX. So if you could just quickly recap that, but the question part is, where do you know to transition from one into the next?
Thank you, Joe. This is actually a great question because often our clients are also confused about this. Let's say it once again. UX is about the logic behind the design, how things work, how they should work, what the workflows are. And UI design is about how the software will look like and how the interactions will be perceived by the users, let's say. Normally what happens is that we have clients investing in the wrong type of design because they are not aware of the problems that they have. For instance, we will have clients that have invested quite a lot in modernizing their look while they have problems with the actual way that systems work. And this is when they come to us for help normally. They have invested in redesigns, they have a new logo, they have new colors and so on, but somehow the users are not satisfied with this and they're trying to figure out where the problem actually lies.
Did anyone want to add?
Yeah, I mean, for us, oftentimes we'll work with customers and talk to the actual end users, and there's a common theme among many of our customers in terms of, hey, it's just taking me too many steps to complete a particular task in our enterprise and with our existing application, and we need to look at things differently and create maybe a more efficient workflow. And I think that's really where the UX people come in and really understand that the steps needed to complete a task, and then build a user experience that's pleasing and efficient for the end user. The other thing I might add is, if you're building a house, you wouldn't turn carpenters and masons loose without giving them some sort of a blueprint. And I think this is where UX comes in. The UX engineers are really a critical part of developing that blueprint to give to the actual builders of the front end part of the solution.
Okay, thank you to both of you. And the question came in about what software are you using for the interface? I think that was Figma.
Correct. We are using Figma both as software for designing the interface, for validating workflows, for communicating with developers, communicating with other stakeholders. And we also use it for user testing and validating everything before we turn the work to the devs for implementation.
Great. Okay, so there was actually a Figma specific question. And how do you spell that? It's with an F, F-I-G-M-A. The question was, how does using Figma make it easier for developers to translate designs into production-ready components?
TK, should I take this? Okay.
Yes, I'll take that. Thanks. Yeah. Well, firstly, what I think is very important is the fact that once we receive an artifact from Figma, we are actually getting something that has probably passed several iterations, and it's rethought not only from how things would look like, but also from requirements point of view. And we know that the story that comes to us come with a good maturity level. So we have a high confidence when we are estimating and planning the delivery. And we're also confident on the fact how whether there would be an additional feedback at the end of that. Sometimes there is, but usually the critical step and basically the uncertainty has been removed by creating that prototype. And then when we're talking about the specific of the artifacts, what we are getting out of the designers through Figma is basically a map of the whole layout of the system, the behavior, and the interaction that you can get navigating between different parts of the software, the responsiveness when we are talking about different form factors. So imagine that you're having a web solution that also needs to run on a tablet or on a phone, and also the details of how the whole UI is built under the hood based on a common set of principles. This might be a unified set of components that are used for specific patterns, as well as specific styling and specific themes that are applied throughout the application. All of this is already embedded and provided by the developer when it's creating the control library within Figma, and this is something that we take and apply to the final product.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think embracing a platform like Figma is really important, because for all the reasons that TK just described, but it's not just at the beginning, it's ongoing. So if I need to manage or make any kind of branding changes, by embracing a platform like Figma, I can do that pretty easily without having to do a holistic, complete change to all my front end artifacts, right?
Mm-hmm. And you were doing one of the conversations about I think it was the healthcare case study. it looked like there was very much a computer desktop type version that was needed, as well as a more mobile version. What do you run into when you experience users that need multiple interfaces?
Normally, what we do is that we face the expectation from the user to have absolutely everything from the web interface into the mobile interface. And this is maybe not the user, but the stakeholder expectation. What we need to communicate and to convince them is that we need to rethink the smaller resolutions to be functional without having all of the complexity of the web resolutions, and then to help them to restructure or rethink the way that the different user personas will use them, so that we can provide them with just the content they need at the point of interaction that they are at the current moment. And
Great
of course,
point.
we have also accessibility to take in mind. You cannot just take one web design and just scale it down to be mobile and to be tablet. We have to take functionality and accessibility into account.
That's great. Well, man, there's so much information packed into our time today. We're actually about to run out of time. So Chris, would you mind finishing up for us here? I was just wondering, what is the final thought that you want people to walk away with today? And of course, we have to thank our friends at Resolute.
Yeah, as I alluded to earlier, user experience is really important in terms of defining the overall blueprint for the end user and for the application solution. And it's more than just establishing pixelation and colors. It's about workflow efficiency and making sure that the users of the solution are getting what they want, and they're able to accomplish the tasks they need to accomplish on a daily basis in the most efficient way possible. Because as I mentioned, that's often the biggest complaint or the biggest thing we hear back from end users when we start talking about doing a modernization assessment is just too many steps to complete a task, whether it's an old character interface, web interfaces, even graphical interfaces. It seems to be the same thing. So that would be my final thought.
That's great. Sounds good. Well, like I said, thank you everyone from Resolute for joining us today on this webinar. It was fascinating information. We appreciate your expertise. Thank you, Chris, for your expertise, and
Sure.
to everyone who attended. Hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.